Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my movie review series. So it's been a long ass time since I last made a movie review on this channel. I feel like I say that every time I make one, since I do it very sparingly these days. It's just something that I very occasionally get the urge to do. And I'm sure you've noticed that when I do choose to review a movie, it tends to be movies that are more obscure and less well known, and movies that either appeal to me for some reason, or that I feel like I can add my own unique perspective on. I've done a lot of movie reviews in the past, so check out my movie review playlist in the description section if you want to. Today I'm going to be talking about a movie that I've seen about 3 times now, and it's one that I saw for the first time a couple of years ago, when I randomly came across it in a second-hand DVD store, The Weatherman, released in 2005, starring Nicolas Cage. This is an interesting movie to me, and it's one that I didn't hear of when it first came out. In fact, when I first watched it a couple of years ago, that was actually the first time I'd ever heard of it. I don't think the movie did very well on its release financially, and I can't remember there being any promotion for it whatsoever. Also, the critics didn't like it very much either. It basically went completely into obscurity, and barely ever got talked about again. Which is weird when you consider how many big names were involved with it. It was directed by Gore Verbinski, who of course famously directed the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, which I'm actually a big fan of. Well, the first two anyway. I'm not a big fan of the third one. I think the first two are great though. Really entertaining. I'd say that they're just popcorn flicks that are just really fun to watch. This movie, however, came out around about the same time as them, and it's not that kind of movie at all. This is a more slow-paced, character-driven film, and it's one of those films that when I first watched it, I really enjoyed it, but weirdly I couldn't really figure out why, because it's honestly not the kind of film I'd usually take to. It wasn't until I watched the movie a second time that I actually started to realise why I liked it. So as I mentioned before, the movie stars Nicolas Cage, who in my opinion was, at this point in his career, a fantastic actor. This was of course before he basically became a living meme and a caricature of himself. Back when he actually used to give a crap about his movies and play a character rather than just playing himself, and I honestly think that this is one of his best acting performances. He plays a local Chicago weatherman, who despite having a reasonably well-paid career, his life is basically falling apart. The movie's essentially a dark comedy which is very satirical and has a pretty strange and unusual tone, with some pretty drastic tonal shifts. It's a movie that starts out really comedic and really goofy, but as it goes on, it gets considerably darker and more realistic. And it also starts to get a bit depressing at times. Despite being a weatherman, which makes him kind of a local celebrity, it doesn't actually bring him any fulfillment at all, since everyone basically knows that his job is utterly worthless, and all he really does is read teleprompters. It actually makes him a bit of a target, since he basically gets harassed and hounded everywhere he goes, and people even throw things at him. This is kind of one of the running jokes in the movie. Cage will be just going about his day, and someone will throw a pie at him, or a soda, or something like that. More seriously than that though, his wife left him, kicked him out, and is dating another man. So he's basically a cook paying for another man to sleep with his wife and raise his kids. In addition to that, his kids are basically failing in school and life in general. His daughter is an overweight chain smoker, despite only being 12 years old. She gets picked on in school and is depressed, miserable, and has no hobbies or interests whatsoever. His son, who's only 15, is a juvenile delinquent who is being forced to undergo counselling. And to make matters worse, his counsellor is a sodomite who's grooming him, preying on the fact that he doesn't have a stable father figure, making him vulnerable. This highlights what I was talking about earlier, when I was talking about the movie having drastic shifts in tone. One minute it'll be quite whimsical and goofy. Scenes with Cage trying to teach his daughter archery, and basically trying to narrate his own life in a very funny and satirical way. Then you have these really awkward, uncomfortable scenes of his son being groomed by this creep. And it isn't played for laughs, those scenes are actually taken very seriously, and I feel as if it's supposed to highlight the fact that Cage isn't there for his kids, and if he was there, and if he was more of a stable father figure, then they wouldn't be having these problems. And the movie makes it very clear that he's spending a lot of time trying to fix his daughter, completely turning a blind eye to what's going on with his son. I actually found that quite interesting. To top it all off, Cage's dad in the movie, who's played by Michael Caine, is utterly ashamed of him, or at least it's implied that he's ashamed of him, since it's not explicitly stated in the movie. But basically every single interaction between them gives that impression. And you get the sense that Cage is just constantly seeking his father's approval, trying to live up to his expectations, but nothing he really does has the desired effect. Another thing that kind of becomes a running joke in the movie, and you get the sense that it's one of the main reasons for Cage's life falling apart so badly, is the fact that he can't seem to focus on anything. He constantly daydreams and has intrusive thoughts that lead to him basically forgetting important information all the time, or messing up in some way. There's a really funny scene in the movie where Cage has a flashback to a time when his wife asked him to pick up some tartar sauce for dinner, and his daydreaming and intrusive thoughts cause him to forget what she sent him for, and he comes home without it, and she basically ends up losing the plot. And it's implied that this is a common thing with him, that actually contributes to them splitting up, which basically emphasises how meaningless little annoyances can lead to a big argument, or can build up over time and spiral out of control. I actually found that aspect of the movie really relatable, since I actually do that all the time, but I digress. So basically you spend the vast majority of the movie watching a guy who is desperately unfulfilled, and whose life is falling apart. It's interesting because I've heard some people say that that kind of thing is very difficult to watch, since it too accurately captures the harshness of life in general, and can make you feel a bit depressed. Spider-Man 2 was kinda like that, and I've heard certain people say that they struggle to watch movies like that. Me personally though, I actually really like that kind of meta-analysis in movies, and I think when it's done right it can be really fun to watch. You find out early in the movie that Cage's father was a successful writer, and Cage always feels as if he's constantly living in his shadow, and can never leave a legacy that he can live up to his. He tries to write a book himself, and is just utterly terrible at it. His wife even insults him for it in one scene that was pretty funny. And it's something that he's very insecure about. This is something that starts off as a bit of a running joke, but as the movie goes on, it actually proves to be a pretty major aspect of Cage's character development. I also really like how as the movie goes along, as I mentioned before, the tone starts to get a lot darker and a lot more serious, as well as a lot more realistic. But at the same time, Cage starts to learn a lot more about himself and about his family. And you start to realise that one of the biggest problems he has, and one of the main reasons for his failure at every turn, is the overall lack of self-worth. He basically hates himself. He hates everything about himself. And it's as if he thinks that if he's not around, then his wife and kids will be better off. There's also some really touching scenes in the movie, where his father tries to be a guiding figure in his life, and even tries to reassure him that he needs to stop trying to be like him, and instead try to be his own person, and embrace his own talents. He realised that if he's ever going to get his family back, and get his life back on track, then he's going to have to do a few very specific things. He applies for a new higher paying job, where he presents the weather for a much bigger network, and he even tries to educate himself on meteorology, so that he can actually understand the job that he's trying to do, rather than just going out there and reading a script. He also has to find himself a hobby, something that can help to stop his mind from wandering, and get rid of all the intrusive thoughts, giving him something constructive and fun to focus his mind on, and he chooses archery, which I actually really enjoy myself, perhaps one of the reasons I like the movie. There's a lot of scenes where he just stands around shooting targets, and you get the sense that there's a lot of visual storytelling going on in these scenes. He also tries to get his daughter into it to bring her out of her shell and give her something to do, and as the movie goes on, the daughter starts to smile more and just generally be happier, and it's all because she's spending time with her dad, and that's something that the character needed to realise, that all his kids really needed was for him to be there and to pay attention to them and not be inside his head so much. It's also a movie that's really well shot. I like the overall aesthetic of the movie, with it taking place during winter, and I think the soundtrack complements this. One thing that I didn't like very much when I first saw the movie was the ending, because it's a situation where if you're like me, and you appreciate traditional family values, you want to see a good ending, you want to see everything work out for the better. You want to see Cage reconcile with his wife and move back in, so that they can be a family again and raise their kids together. And that's one of the primary motivational goals for Cage's character in the movie, to get his wife and kids back full time. But yeah, spoiler alert, that doesn't exactly happen. But watching the movie again, I think the ending we got was a bit more realistic, and it made more sense given what led up to it. And at least on a positive note, he does reconcile with his dad, his kids, and he becomes more fulfilled as a person by the end of the movie. But it's kind of a bittersweet way in which it concludes, you know? All in all, I see this movie as a pretty entertaining and pretty interesting art film, and one that I'm actually quite surprised doesn't have more fans than it does. Seriously, I don't think I've ever heard anybody else even talk about this movie before. It's really not that well known at all, it's actually quite obscure. But I really enjoyed it, and I give it a solid 7 out of 10. I'd recommend it. Thanks for watching, guys. Stay tuned for more movie reviews. I really enjoyed making this one. Let me know if you want to see more. Thanks for watching. God bless.